1954, LaGrange, Illinois. The assembly floor of Electromotive Division hummed with the systematic rhythm of post-war American manufacturing as workers bolted together another General Motors locomotive that railroad executives considered thoroughly ordinary. In an era obsessed with streamlined passenger trains and record-breaking horsepower ratings, the GP9 looked exactly what it was, a practical freight hauler with modest specifications that promised nothing extraordinary. While Baldwin Locomotive Works marketed turbocharged monsters generating 2,400 horsepower and Union Pacific unveiled gas turbine behemoths that could pull entire mountains of freight, EMD quietly produced a 1,000 horsepower workhorse that railroad purchasing agents ordered primarily because the price was right. The GP9 cost $142,000 in 1954, roughly half the investment required for the more powerful road switchers that dominated industry headlines. Eastern Railroad executives, still loyal to aging steam locomotives and skeptical of diesel-electric technology, dismissed the GP9 as pedestrian equipment that lacked the raw power needed for serious mainline operations. The specifications seemed unimpressive compared to competing designs. A 5.7C prime mover running 16 cylinders in a two-stroke cycle, D77 traction motors producing adequate but unremarkable pulling force, and electrical systems based on technology that had changed little since wartime production. What purchasing departments failed to recognize was that EMD's chief engineer Richard Dilworth had made design decisions that prioritized reliability over raw performance specifications. While competitors chased horsepower ratings that looked impressive in marketing brochures, Dilworth's team focused on mechanical simplicity and maintenance accessibility that would matter far more during decades of daily operation. The GP9's 567 engine represented evolutionary refinement rather than revolutionary innovation. EMD had been building variations of this two-stroke diesel since 1938. Accumulating operational data from millions of service miles across every climate and terrain in North America. Each iteration incorporated lessons learned from field failures, gradually eliminating weak points that caused premature breakdowns in earlier designs. Dilworth understood something that procurement specialists overlooked in their focus on initial purchase price. The total cost of locomotive ownership depended far more on maintenance expenses and operational availability than on the numbers printed in specification sheets. A machine that generated 1,750 reliable horsepower every day for 20 years provided more value than a 2,400 horsepower unit that spent half its service life awaiting repairs. The first, GP9, rolled off EMD's production line in January 1954, painted in demonstration livery that would tour the country seeking orders from railroad executives who remained unconvinced that diesels could truly replace steam. Power. It weighed 244,000 pounds, stretched 56 feet from coupler to coupler, and carried fuel tanks holding 1,200 gallons of diesel. Nothing about its appearance suggested it would become the most durable freight locomotive in American railroad history. By December 1954, EMD had delivered 347 GP9s to railroads across North America. The production numbers would eventually exceed 4,000 units, making it one of the most successful locomotive designs ever manufactured. But in those early months, nobody suspected that some of these ordinary-looking machines would still be pulling freight in the 21st century. The maintenance manual for the GP9 arrived at railroad shops as a 600-page document that revealed EMD's fundamental design philosophy through specifications most railroad managers never fully examined. While competitors delivered locomotives with proprietary components requiring factory-authorized service, Dilworth's team had engineered the GP9 around standardized parts that any competent diesel mechanic could maintain. Harold Jensen, a master mechanic at Chicago and Northwestern's Clinton, Iowa facility, immediately recognized what made the GP9 different when the railroad's first units arrived in March 1954. The electrical cabinet doors opened with standard tools, every major component carried stamped identification numbers, and the service intervals followed logical patterns that maintenance crews could actually remember. Jensen had spent 15 years maintaining Baldwin and Alco diesels that required specialized equipment for basic inspections and featured components arranged in configurations that seemed designed to maximize technician frustration. The GP9's systematic layout suggested that someone at EMD actually understood what happened in railroad shops at 2 a.m. when a critical locomotive needed emergency repairs. The 567C engine demonstrated this practical engineering philosophy in every aspect of its design. Each power assembly, the complete cylinder unit including piston, liner, and cylinder head, could be removed and replaced as a single component in approximately 4 hours. This modular design meant that catastrophic failures requiring extensive engine disassembly on competing locomotives became routine maintenance procedures on the GP9. Traction motors, the electrical machines that actually turned the wheels, used Class B insulation rated for continuous operation at temperatures that would destroy the Class A insulation found in earlier designs. The 15-degree temperature margin seemed insignificant in engineering calculations, but it translated to thousands of additional operating hours before insulation breakdown required motor rewinding. Cooling systems incorporated redundancy that prevented single-point failures from disabling entire locomotives. Twin radiator sections with independent shutters allowed continued operation even when one cooling bank failed, while dual-circuit electrical systems ensured that partial failures never resulted in complete power loss. These features added weight and complexity that efficiency experts questioned, but they multiplied operational reliability in ways that spreadsheet analysis couldn't fully capture. The air brake system, often overlooked in discussions of locomotive performance, received the same methodical engineering attention. EMD specified Westinghouse 26L brake equipment known for consistent performance across temperature extremes ranging from Montana winters to Texas summers. Brake valves mounted in heated compartments that prevented moisture freezing, a detail that seemed trivial until winter operations revealed how quickly inferior systems failed in sub-freezing conditions. What appeared to casual observers as conservative engineering actually represented sophisticated understanding of failure modes and maintenance realities. Every component specification reflected data from millions of service miles. Every accessibility feature addressed problems that technicians encountered during actual repairs, and every redundancy eliminated failure scenarios that had disabled locomotives in previous generations. Burlington Root's mechanical superintendent, speaking at a 1956 industry conference, noted that GP9s were averaging 28 days between unscheduled maintenance events compared to 11 days for comparable locomotives from other manufacturers. The difference seemed modest in statistical terms, but translated to dramatic improvements in operational availability that transformed railroad economics. The engineering decisions that made these reliability improvements possible remained invisible to everyone except the mechanics who maintained the machines and the accountants who calculated total ownership costs. The Southern Pacific's Roseville, California yard received its first GP9s in July 1954, and within weeks they were assigned to one of the most punishing duties in American railroading, dragging freight over Donner Pass, the 7,000-foot granite barrier that had challenged railroad operations since the Transcontinental Railroad's completion in Unit 3197, a standard production GP9 painted in Southern Pacific's distinctive black and silver livery, began service pulling 60-car manifest trains up the Tukey grades that climbed from Sacramento Valley into the Sierra Nevada. The assignment required continuous maximum power output for hours at a time, operating conditions that exposed every weakness in locomotive design and revealed the true meaning of mechanical durability. Robert Martinez, a Southern Pacific engineer with 20 years of mountain railroading experience, initially approached the GP9 with skepticism born from watching too many promising new locomotives fail under Donner's brutal conditions. Steam locomotives had dominated these grades for good reason. They delivered maximum power regardless of ambient temperature and could be repaired with tools and parts available at any division point. The GP9's first winter on Donner Pass tested every aspect of EMD's engineering philosophy. January temperatures regularly dropped below zero, conditions that caused electrical failures in earlier diesel designs and created starting problems that left locomotives stranded in mountain snowsheds. The 567C engine, equipped with heavy-duty starting motors and fuel heaters that maintain combustion chamber temperatures, consistently fired on the first attempt even when overnight temperatures reached minus 15 degrees. Martinez discovered that the GP9's systematic engineering extended to details most manufacturers overlooked. Battery compartments included insulated enclosures with thermostatically controlled heaters that maintained optimal operating temperature without wasting fuel. Air compressors featured automatic drains that prevented moisture accumulation from freezing brake systems, a refinement that eliminated the manual draining procedures required on competing designs. Summer operations presented different challenges that proved equally demanding. Pulling freight through the Sierra foothills in August meant ambient temperatures exceeding 100 degrees, while radiators struggled to dissipate heat generated by engines operating at maximum output. The GP9's cooling system, sized for worst-case combinations of high ambient temperature and continuous full-power operation, maintained safe operating temperatures while competitors experienced thermal shutdowns that stranded trains on mountain grades. By December 1955, Southern Pacific's maintenance records revealed operational patterns that contradicted industry assumptions about locomotive durability. Unit 3197 had accumulated 127,000 miles in 18 months of continuous service, primarily on mountain grades that represented the most severe duty cycle in North American railroading. Scheduled maintenance had followed normal intervals, but unscheduled repairs totaled less than 40 hours, a figure that seemed almost impossible for equipment operating under such punishing conditions. The mileage accumulation rate suggested something that railroad accountants found difficult to believe. Properly maintained GP9s could potentially exceed 1 million miles of service before requiring major overhauls. Previous diesel locomotives typically needed complete engine rebuilds at 400,000 to 600,000 miles, while steam locomotives rarely exceeded 200,000 miles between major repairs. Nobody at Southern Pacific's headquarters in San Francisco believed Unit 3197 represented normal performance. The assumption was that this particular locomotive had somehow received exceptional maintenance or avoided the worst operating conditions. The reality would take another decade to fully reveal. The maintenance logbook for Santa Fe Railway GP9 Unit 2548 began in April 1955 with routine entries that tracked oil changes, brake inspections, and minor repairs typical of new locomotive service. Chief Mechanical Officer Thomas Sullivan filed the records with hundreds of similar documents, never imagining that this particular logbook would eventually span 2 decades and document something no diesel locomotive had previously achieved. Unit 2548 entered service on Santa Fe's transcontinental main line between Chicago and Los Angeles, a 10,200-mile route that crossed prairies, mountains, and deserts while handling freight traffic that ranged from refrigerated produce to heavy machinery. The assignment placed the locomotive in continuous rotation, typically accumulating 8,000 to 10,000 miles monthly through a mixture of manifest freight, time-sensitive shipments, and occasional passenger train substitutions. By 1960, Unit 2548 had logged 447,000 miles, a figure that approached the service life expectancy for most diesel locomotives. Santa Fe's maintenance department scheduled a comprehensive inspection, expecting to find worn cylinder liners, degraded electrical insulation, and frame cracks that typically appeared at this mileage threshold. The inspection revealed wear patterns that suggested the locomotive had barely begun its operational life. Cylinder bore measurements showed less than 0.005 of an inch deviation from new specifications, indicating that piston rings and cylinder liners had experienced minimal degradation despite 5 years of continuous operation. Traction motor brushes, which typically required replacement every 250,000 miles, showed 4% remaining service life. Electrical insulation tested well above minimum standards, and ultrasonic inspection of frame components revealed no stress cracks or metal fatigue. Sullivan, who had witnessed dozens of locomotive overhauls during his 30-year career, recognized that Unit 2548 represented something unprecedented in railroad mechanical history. The standard practice called for complete engine rebuilds at 600,000 miles, a preventive measure based on failure rates observed across thousands of locomotives. The GP9's condition suggested that this service interval, while appropriate for earlier designs, was unnecessarily conservative for EMD's latest engineering. The decision to continue operating Unit 2548 without major overhaul required approval from Santa Fe's senior management, who understood that mechanical failures on mainline freight trains created cascading delays affecting entire railroad networks. Sullivan submitted engineering data demonstrating that the GP9's actual wear rates were 6% lower than design predictions, suggesting that million-mile service intervals might be achievable with appropriate monitoring. By 1965, Unit 2548 had exceeded 820,000 miles, a figure that railroad industry publications noted as remarkable for continuous service without major component replacement. Competing locomotives from Baldwin and Alco typically required complete rebuilds by 500,000 miles, with many units experiencing catastrophic failures before reaching overhaul intervals. The GP9's ability to operate reliably beyond these traditional limits challenged fundamental assumptions about diesel locomotive maintenance economics. Trade magazines published articles questioning whether Santa Fe's experience represented normal GP9 performance or statistical anomaly resulting from exceptional maintenance practices. Other railroads began examining their own GP9 fleets, discovering that above-average longevity appeared to be characteristic of the design rather than exception to normal operating patterns. The million-mile milestone approached as Unit 2548 continued accumulating mileage through the late 1960s, and Sullivan prepared documentation that would verify this achievement represented genuine operational service rather than carefully managed test conditions. The telegram from Santa Fe's Barstow, California yard arrived at Sullivan's office on a Tuesday morning in January 1968, reporting that Unit 2548 had experienced a complete electrical failure during a routine freight run across the Mojave Desert. The locomotive, now carrying 90,000 miles on its original prime mover, had finally encountered the catastrophic breakdown that industry experts had predicted must eventually occur. Sullivan dispatched senior electrical engineer Margaret Chen to Barstow with instructions to document every aspect of the failure before authorizing repairs. If Unit 2548 required major overhaul at this mileage, the million-mile milestone would remain theoretical rather than actual achievement. More significantly, a major failure at this stage would validate critics who argued that extended service intervals sacrificed reliability for short-term cost savings. Chen arrived at Barstow Yard to find Unit 2548 sitting on a maintenance track surrounded by 3 younger GP9s that had already been sidelined for major electrical repairs. The irony was immediately apparent. Locomotives with half the service miles were awaiting component replacement, while the highest mileage unit in Santa Fe's fleet had experienced its first significant failure after nearly 1 million miles of continuous operation. Initial diagnosis revealed that the main generator, the massive electrical machine that converted mechanical power from the diesel engine into electrical current for the traction motors, had suffered bearing failure. This component, rated for 500,000 miles of service, had operated for nearly twice its design life before exhibiting any problems. The failure mode provided crucial information about the GP9's actual durability versus conservative engineering specifications. Detailed inspection revealed that the generator bearing failure resulted from lubricant contamination rather than normal wear progression. A defective seal had allowed dirt infiltration, creating abrasive conditions that accelerated bearing deterioration. The bearing surfaces themselves showed wear patterns consistent with contaminated operation rather than the fatigue cracking that characterized normal service life exhaustion. Chen's investigation expanded to comprehensive examination of every major component, creating documentation that would serve as reference data for locomotive engineers studying extended service intervals. The 567C engine, disassembled for the first time since manufacture, revealed cylinder bores still within new specifications and main bearings showing minimal wear. Piston rings retained sufficient tension for proper compression sealing, and fuel injectors demonstrated spray patterns that matched factory standards. Traction motors, removed and tested on dynamometer equipment, produced power output within 3% of new specifications. Electrical insulation resistance measurements exceeded minimum standards by comfortable margins, and mechanical components showed no evidence of fatigue or stress cracking. The overall condition suggested that Unit 2548 could easily achieve another 500,000 miles of service with routine maintenance. The generator bearing replacement required 3 days of intensive repair work, but the component swap could be accomplished without disturbing the engine or electrical systems. Total repair cost, including parts and labor, amounted to $8,400, less than 6% of a new locomotive's purchase price. This economic reality demonstrated that even major component failures at extreme mileage intervals remained far more cost-effective than premature overhaul schedules. Unit 2548 returned to service in February 1968 and achieved the 1 million-mile milestone during a routine freight run between Needles and Barstow on March 17, 1968. No ceremony marked the achievement, just a notation in the maintenance logbook documenting this unprecedented accomplishment. Thomas Sullivan's comprehensive report on Unit 2548's million-mile achievement reached railroad executives across North America during the summer of 1968, and the financial implications immediately captured attention from companies struggling with rising operating costs and increasing competition from trucking companies. The detailed maintenance cost analysis revealed economic realities that challenged fundamental assumptions about locomotive fleet management. Traditional diesel locomotive economics assumed complete overhaul at 600,000 miles, with major component replacement costing approximately $85,000 per unit in 1968 dollars. This figure represented 60% of a new locomotive's purchase price, making fleet replacement decisions critically dependent on projected overhaul frequency and total service life expectations. Unit 2548's actual maintenance costs over 1 million miles totaled $127,000, a figure that included all routine servicing, component replacements, and the generator bearing repair that represented its only major unscheduled maintenance event. This compared to typical diesel locomotives requiring $200,000 to $250,000 in maintenance expenditures over similar mileage, with many units experiencing catastrophic failures that required complete rebuilding or early retirement. The cost differential translated to profound implications for railroad profitability. Santa Fe operated approximately 600 GP9s by 1968, and if the entire fleet achieved similar longevity, the maintenance savings would exceed $40 million for the locomotive's operational lives. This represented capital that could fund track improvements, yard modernization, or fleet expansion without requiring additional financing. Railroad financial analysts began examining their GP9 fleets with renewed attention, discovering patterns that confirmed Santa Fe's experience represented normal performance rather than statistical anomaly. Burlington Northern's mechanical department reported GP9s averaging 780,000 miles before first major overhaul, while Southern Pacific documented units exceeding 850,000 miles with only routine component replacements. The reliability data revealed something equally significant. GP9 spent less time awaiting repairs than newer, more powerful locomotives. Average availability rates for GP9 fleets exceeded 92%, meaning that on any given day, not of units were available for service. Competing designs from the same era typically achieved 78% to 85% availability, with the difference representing substantial lost revenue from trains delayed or canceled due to power shortages. Industry publications began featuring articles analyzing the GP9 phenomenon, attempting to explain why this particular design achieved durability that exceeded both its contemporaries and many locomotives introduced years later with supposedly superior technology. The consensus focused on EMD's conservative engineering approach: components rated well beyond minimum requirements, systematic redundancy in critical systems, and maintenance accessibility that encouraged, rather than discouraged, proper servicing. By 1970, used GP9 values began reflecting the locomotive's proven longevity. Units with 600,000 miles of service, traditionally considered near end of life, were selling for prices that approached new locomotive costs just 15 years earlier. Railroads discovered that well-maintained GP9s represented better investments than newer designs with higher horsepower but unproven reliability records. The financial transformation extended beyond simple maintenance economics. Insurance companies reduced premiums for railroads operating GP9 heavy fleets, recognizing that these locomotives posed lower risk of catastrophic failures that could cause derailments or service disruptions. Lending institutions factored GP9 fleet composition into credit evaluations, understanding that these assets would retain value far longer than industry standards had previously assumed. The forgotten locomotive that nobody considered remarkable in 1954 had become the most economically valuable freight power in American railroading. 6 decades after the first GP9 rolled off EMD's production line, more than 400 units remain in active service across North America, a longevity record that continues defying conventional expectations about mechanical equipment lifespan. These survivors operate for regional railroads, short-line carriers, and industrial facilities, still performing the unglamorous freight hauling duties they were designed to handle in the 1950s. The Fillmore and Western Railway in California operates GP9 Unit 103, a locomotive manufactured in 1907 that has accumulated an estimated 1.8 million miles through 6 decades of continuous service. The unit has received 3 major overhauls during its operational life, but each rebuild essentially returned it to original specifications rather than incorporating significant design modifications. The philosophy reflects recognition that EMD's original engineering required no fundamental improvements. Regional carriers discovered that GP9s offered economic advantages that extended beyond simple maintenance costs. The locomotive's 1,750 horsepower rating proved ideally suited for the branch line and industrial switching operations that constituted most short-line railroad business. More powerful modern locomotives consumed excessive fuel when operated at partial power settings, while the GP9's smaller engine ran efficiently across its entire operating range. Environmental regulations implemented during the 1990s and 2000s threatened to force retirement of older diesel locomotives that couldn't meet emission standards applicable to new equipment. Several railroads invested in GP9 modernization programs, installing updated fuel injection systems and exhaust treatment equipment that reduced emissions while maintaining the locomotive's fundamental mechanical simplicity. The upgrade costs, typically $60,000 to $80,000 per unit, remained far below new locomotive purchase prices exceeding $2 million. Kyle Railways in Saskatchewan operates a fleet of 12 GP9s that handle grain trains across hundreds of miles of prairie branch lines. The company's mechanical superintendent notes that parts availability remains excellent despite the locomotive's age, with many components still manufactured to original specifications or available through specialized rebuilders who support the substantial GP9 population still in service. The contrast with locomotives introduced during subsequent decades proves particularly striking. EMD's own GP38 and GP40 models, introduced during the 1960s and 1970s with higher horsepower and supposedly improved technology, experienced significantly higher failure rates and shorter service lives. Many of these newer designs were retired decades before GP9s from the 1950s, revealing that increased complexity and power ratings often came at the cost of fundamental reliability. Museum preservation efforts have saved approximately 75 GP9s for historical display, but the majority of survivors continue, performing actual railroad work rather than serving as static exhibits. This represents perhaps the most compelling testament to the design's enduring value. After 6 decades, these locomotives remain more useful as working machines than as historical artifacts. The engineering philosophy that Richard Dilworth and his team implemented in the GP9 established principles that influenced locomotive design for generations. Subsequent EMD products incorporated the same emphasis on maintenance accessibility, component durability, and systematic redundancy that made the GP9 legendary. The forgotten locomotive that railroad executives dismissed as ordinary in 1954 had proven that the most remarkable achievements often come from designs that prioritize lasting over flash, reliability over raw power, and engineering substance over marketing spectacle.